The camera was already rolling when it happened. Kellyanne Conway, once the polished architect of Trump's spin machine, leaned forward in her chair, her voice sharp, her face flushed a deep red under the unforgiving studio lights. Her words tumbled out fast, louder with every sentence, until they weren't words anymore but pure rage projected into the microphone. It was the kind of scream meant to dominate, to silence, to overwhelm. And in that moment, the studio fell into a strange kind of stillness. Frozen, as if the air itself refused to move until this outburst played itself out. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. Commentators watching from the control room exchanged wide-eyed glances. This wasn't political discourse anymore. This was spectacle. Kellyanne, the master of controlling a narrative, was unraveling before a live national audience, her fists clenched, her voice cracked, and the arrogance she once wore like armor now sounded like desperation. "Freeze the frame there!" Kellyanne in mid-yell, the veins at her temples tightening, her expression locked somewhere between fury and disbelief. This was the headline moment, the viral spark, the explosion that would be clipped, shared, replayed a million times across timelines and group chats. Kellyanne Conway screams on live TV. That alone was enough to ignite the political internet. But the story didn't stop there. Because just a few feet away, Jasmine Crockett hadn't moved. Her posture remained steady, her eyes calm, her breathing controlled. She let the storm rage and spent her silence like currency, saving it for the exact moment when it would matter most. That composure, in the face of Conway's chaos, wasn't weakness. It was power. And it was about to change everything. The audience didn't yet know they were seconds away from witnessing a pivot that would echo across the country. For Kellyanne, this was an unraveling. For Jasmine, this was the moment she had been preparing for without ever saying a word. When Kellyanne Conway unleashed fury on live television, the nation leaned in, but no one was ready for what came next. And then, with a single calm sentence, Jasmine Crockett flipped the script. Why did this clash matter so much? Because it wasn't happening in a closed room or behind the guarded doors of Washington. It was unfolding live, broadcast into millions of homes across the country. On that night, the television studio became a stage for something bigger than a shouting match. It became a mirror reflecting the country's deeper struggle: chaos versus composure, arrogance versus dignity, noise versus truth. Every viewer could feel the tension cutting through their screens. This wasn't just another fiery exchange in a news cycle littered with them. This was Kellyanne Conway, the face of a political era defined by bluster and spin, showing once again the tactics that had carried her into history. Drown out opponents, dominate the airwaves, seize control through sheer volume. She was a veteran of this game, and for years it had worked. She had been the spokeswoman who coined alternative facts, the strategist who could twist a question into a weapon, the relentless fighter who never yielded ground, not even when the facts weren't on her side. But in this moment, all of that expertise seemed to collapse in on itself. What once looked like strategy now looked like desperation. Her shouts didn't sound powerful, they sounded panicked. Her energy didn't come across as confidence, it read as loss of control. And Americans watching could sense it. The aura of command was cracking, and the harder she tried to shout it back into existence, the weaker it appeared. And then there was Jasmine Crockett, a rising figure who, until recently, had been relatively unknown outside political circles. A congresswoman, a lawyer, a voice for accountability. She carried herself with the quiet steel of someone who had been underestimated before, and had turned that underestimation into fuel. Crockett didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. Her presence was her statement. Her silence was her preparation. Her poise in the face of a screaming opponent spoke volumes before she ever uttered a word. The cameras caught every detail, the fury in Conway's face, the calm written across Crockett's, two portraits locked side by side on split screen, the past and the future, colliding in real time. To millions watching, the contrast couldn't have been sharper. It wasn't simply about two women in disagreement, it was about two visions of America colliding on live television. One vision shouted down opponents, demanded dominance, treated truth as negotiable. The other held steady, believed that dignity itself was a weapon and that composure could slice sharper than any scream. People watching from living rooms, coffee shops, and airports felt it in their bones. This was about more than politics. It was about respect. It was about identity. It was about who gets to claim the narrative of America, those who shout the loudest, or those who stand calmest in the storm. Kellyanne Conway had made her move. She had played her card, the only one she knew. Overwhelm, intimidate, dominate. The entire country could see it. But what no one realized, not yet, was that Jasmine Crockett was about to answer in a way that would leave Conway's playbook in shreds. Because the real fireworks weren't about volume. They weren't about how high someone could scream. They were about composure, about a single moment of calm clarity cutting through the noise. What Jasmine said next would echo far beyond this studio. To understand why Kellyanne Conway's outburst mattered, you have to understand the persona she had spent years crafting and the cracks that were beginning to show. Kellyanne was no political novice. She had built her reputation as one of the sharpest operatives in Washington, a strategist who could take a chaotic candidate and somehow wrap them in the language of credibility. When Donald Trump surged onto the scene, it was Kellyanne who became his most polished sword. She didn't just defend him, she reframed reality itself. When reporters pressed her on the size of inauguration crowds, she didn't blink. She coined the phrase that would follow her for the rest of her career: alternative facts. It was a moment that revealed both her genius and her flaw. She could twist words into weapons, but in doing so, she unveiled a willingness to bend truth until it broke. Over the years, that became her defining trait. To her supporters, she was a warrior against a hostile press, someone who fought tooth and nail against liberal narratives. To her critics, she was the ultimate spin artist, someone who turned deception into an art form. Either way, she commanded attention. And in politics, attention is currency. But with every appearance, her contradictions grew harder to ignore. She positioned herself as a champion of truth-telling, yet her record was littered with half-truths, contradictions, and verbal acrobatics designed to obscure more than reveal. She claimed to embody strength, yet her strength often came through shouting others down rather than standing calmly on her arguments. For years it worked, but it left her reliant on bluster as her shield. On television, her style was unmistakable, combative, dismissive, relentless. She had a way of speaking past her opponents rather than to them, creating a wall of noise designed to exhaust rather than engage. If you pushed her, she would counterattack. If you challenged her facts, she would shift the goalposts. If you tried to interrupt, she would double her volume until her voice filled the room. The tactic was effective, until the day someone refused to play the game. That's what made this particular clash so different. Kellyanne was deploying her usual arsenal, raising her voice, piling accusations, reaching for the dismissive one-liners that had once disarmed journalists. But this time, the performance rang hollow. Viewers could see the desperation. The rhythm of control she normally commanded slipped away, replaced by something raw, something less calculated. Because beneath the surface of Kellyanne's bravado was a fragile truth. Her control was only as strong as her ability to dominate. When someone refused to be rattled, when someone absorbed her fury without flinching, her power began to evaporate. And that night on live television, Jasmine Crockett proved to be that someone. Kellyanne's scream wasn't just an outburst, It was a tell, a glimpse into what happens when the old tactics no longer work. For years, she had perfected the image of unshakable authority. But when composure met chaos, authority melted into something else. Panic. This is what made the moment electric. Millions of viewers weren't just watching a debate. They were watching the unraveling of a method, a strategy, a persona that had once defined an era of politics. Kellyanne Conway, the woman who could always twist the story, suddenly found herself trapped in one she couldn't control. And the irony was sharp. She had spent years presenting herself as the voice of order in a world of disorder, a guide through the fog of politics. Yet on that stage, she became the very embodiment of the disorder she claimed to resist. The contradictions caught up, and the mask cracked. But here's the twist. Because a villain, in the truest sense of storytelling, is never just evil. They are a symbol. Kellyanne symbolized a mode of politics that thrived on dominance, on bending truth until it broke, on making noise until the silence had no room to breathe. Her scream that night wasn't just her own. It was the echo of years of spin collapsing under the weight of composure, and that is why the moment mattered so deeply. It wasn't only about Kellyanne Conway losing her cool. It was about the image of power itself, losing its grip when faced with calm resistance. The villain wasn't unmasked by louder noise. She was unmasked by dignity. But across from her sat someone very different, and that difference would soon make history. Jasmine Crockett didn't arrive in Congress with the sheen of inherited power or the privilege of family dynasties. She arrived as someone who knew what it meant to struggle, to fight, and to carve out space where the doors weren't exactly open. Before the bright lights of television, she was a lawyer. Not the kind tucked away in corporate boardrooms, but one who stood shoulder to shoulder with clients who often had no one else to defend them. She fought for those who had been overlooked, written off, or told they didn't belong. Every case sharpened her resolve. Every late night buried in paperwork built not only her legal acumen, but also her understanding of dignity, how much it meant and how easily it could be stripped away. Her story wasn't one of shortcuts. It was one of sacrifice, long hours, personal costs, choosing principle over convenience. And in a system where shortcuts often win, that choice carved her reputation as something rare, a principled fighter. Someone who would take the hits and still stand, someone whose commitment wasn't swayed by expediency. That's what made her rise so compelling. She didn't just step into the halls of power. She dragged the weight of lived struggle with her, and in doing so, she carried the stories of those who had never been given the microphone. It showed in her style. When Jasmine spoke, she wasn't reckless. She was sharp, but measured. Her words cut, but not wildly, with precision. There was passion, yes, but always disciplined, controlled, as if she understood that power isn't in the volume, but in the delivery, and that discipline came from knowing what it meant to be underestimated. Too often, women like her, with backgrounds like hers, are told to be quieter, softer, less confrontational. Jasmine learned to flip that script, to use control as her greatest weapon. In the combative arena of politics, that balance set her apart. Where others leaned into theatrics, she leaned into credibility. Where others craved sound bites, she embodied steadiness. Slowly, she became recognized as more than a participant in the political fray. She became a symbol, a reminder that you could fight without flailing, resist without screaming, and lead without demeaning. But perhaps what made her presence across from Kellyanne Conway so striking was that Jasmine represented a different kind of America. Not one propped up by arrogance, but one built on resilience. Not one that shouted to be heard, but one that listened, endured, and stood tall despite the storm. She embodied the underdog values that so many viewers at home recognized in themselves. She wasn't just a politician in that chair. She was a reflection, and that reflection mattered. Because for decades, The national stage had been dominated by those who wielded power through intimidation, louder voices, harsher tones, bigger claims. Jasmine's existence in that space was its own quiet disruption. She didn't need to overpower her opponent with noise. She could outlast them with composure. And that difference was subtle but seismic. Think about the journey that had prepared her for that night. The countless times she had walked into rooms where she wasn't expected to speak, and yet she spoke. The endless battles where she was told she couldn't win, and yet she won. The silent calculations, the learned patience, the decision to rise above the noise rather than sink into it. Each of those moments was a rehearsal for the stage she found herself on, live television, millions of eyes watching, facing a master of chaos. And that's where her strength became undeniable, because in the face of Kellyanne Conway's bluster, Jasmine's calm wasn't simply a reaction. It was the culmination of years of practice, of principle, of discipline honed in the shadows long before the spotlight ever hit her face. For the audience at home, even before she spoke, they could sense it. The power shift wasn't just in what she would say. It was in how she carried herself, unshaken, unmoved, anchored by something deeper than talking points, anchored by the knowledge that sometimes the strongest argument is not the loudest one, but the one delivered with poise when everything else is spinning out of control. That was Jasmine Crockett's edge. It wasn't about clever comebacks or viral zingers, though those would come. It was about her ability to wield silence, discipline, and dignity as tools sharper than any scream. And so, as Kellyanne Conway's fury reverberated through the studio, Jasmine's composure wasn't accidental. It was earned. It was intentional. It was the quiet storm gathering its strength, waiting for the exact moment to unleash. That discipline, that control, it would be the weapon Conway never saw coming. The air inside the studio was charged now, a thick current of energy that everyone could feel, but no one could quite name. The exchange had gone from heated to hostile, from a debate to something closer to a storm. Kellyanne Conway leaned forward again, her words tumbling out in a rapid-fire rhythm, faster and sharper with every breath. She talked over the host, over the panelists, and most importantly, over Jasmine Crockett. The interruptions weren't just aggressive. They were deliberate. Conway's strategy had always been volume, the belief that if she filled the space with enough noise, the other side would suffocate under it. But Jasmine didn't suffocate. She didn't even flinch. Conway's tone climbed higher, accusations spilling across the desk, her voice snapping like whips. She pointed, gestured, jabbed at the air as if she could hammer her point into existence by sheer force of will. At one moment she smirked, at another she sneered, shifting between bravado and condescension as if trying on every mask she'd ever worn on television. Yet behind it all, there was something unmissable. The desperation of someone who knew they were losing the room. Because even as she raised her voice, something else was happening. Something Conway couldn't control. The more she shouted, the more people's eyes drifted to Jasmine. Not because Jasmine was saying anything yet, but because she wasn't. She sat with her shoulders relaxed, her eyes steady, her hands folded loosely in front of her. Her breathing was even. The chaos on her right didn't disturb her rhythm. It was composure so profound it began to feel louder than Conway's shouting. Viewers could sense it. Jasmine's silence wasn't weakness. It was preparation. It was the kind of quiet that builds anticipation, the kind of calm that makes people lean forward in their chairs, waiting for what's coming next. The contrast was cinematic. On one side, Conway, rattled and restless, spitting words like sparks from a fire that had burned too hot for too long. On the other side, Crockett, grounded and deliberate, her presence a cool counterbalance to the blaze. The studio audience noticed. A subtle shift in the room began, heads tilting, expressions tightening, the awareness that something extraordinary was unfolding. This wasn't a normal exchange anymore. It was becoming a duel, not of facts, but of composure versus chaos. And the tension was unbearable. Every word Conway shouted seemed to dig her deeper into a hole, while every moment Crockett stayed silent pulled the audience closer to her orbit. The silence was magnetic, drawing power with every second it stretched. Conway, perhaps sensing this imbalance, only grew louder. She accused, she dismissed, she mocked. She layered insult upon insult as though stacking them high enough would somehow collapse Crockett's resolve. But Crockett did not rise. She did not take the bait. She let the storm swirl unchecked, a quiet figure in the eye of the hurricane. It was a masterclass in restraint, and in that restraint, she built something Conway could not: suspense. People watching at home gripped the arms of their chairs, leaned toward their televisions, waiting, knowing something was coming. Even the host, caught between keeping order and letting the spectacle play, stole a glance at Crockett as if to ask silently, "When are you going to speak?" And that's when the most powerful moment of all arrived, not in words, but in the absence of them. Conway's voice broke into itself, overlapping in anger, colliding with its own momentum. And then, in the tiniest pause between shouts, the silence in the room grew heavy. Time seemed to stretch. For just a beat, all the noise collapsed into nothingness, and in that silence, Jasmine Crockett prepared to strike. And then, silence. For just a moment. Enough for Jasmine to strike. For a beat, the studio was suspended in silence, like the held breath before thunder. Kellyanne's voice had filled every corner, rattled every surface, and then, suddenly, it was gone. The audience was left blinking in the stillness, their ears ringing from the absence of sound. And in that silence sat Jasmine Crockett, calm, steady, unshaken. She didn't lunge to speak, didn't rush to fill the void Conway had created. Instead, she let the quiet linger, each second turning the air heavier, each pause bending the balance of power further toward her. Finally, Jasmine lifted her chin, her eyes meeting Conway's with a steadiness that was almost unnerving. Her posture was deliberate, upright, unflinching, hands resting gently on the desk as though she were anchored by something deeper than the chaos swirling around her. When she spoke, her voice was low, not weak, not hesitant, but grounded. Every syllable carried the weight of intention. It was a voice trained in the courtroom, sharpened by struggle, softened only by discipline. "Kellyanne," she began, her words spaced with the precision of a scalpel. "You can shout all night if you want, but shouting doesn't turn lies into truth." The room seemed to exhale at once, a collective release of tension. Conway blinked, her jaw tightening, her lips curling into a forced smirk. But Crockett didn't stop. She leaned forward ever so slightly, her voice steady, paced like a drumbeat. "The American people are tired of being screamed at. They're tired of chaos, tired of finger-pointing, tired of someone trying to drown out accountability with noise. What they want is honesty. What they need is leadership." The contrast was electric. Moments earlier, Conway's words had crashed over the room like waves, wild and uncontrolled. Now Crockett's voice cut through the air like a clean blade. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The clarity was its own amplification. Viewers at home shifted in their seats. Some nodded, others whispered to themselves. On social media, timelines lit up as the clip hit live feeds. A calm reply after a scream. The juxtaposition was irresistible. Conway tried to recover, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. She chuckled, attempted a dismissive wave of the hand, but the rhythm was broken. The control she once held, the spotlight she once commanded, had slipped away. Every move she made now looked reactive, defensive. Her volume had been her weapon, and Crockett had disarmed it with composure. Jasmine pressed on, her tone unwavering, her words deliberate. "You see, I came here to talk about solutions. I came here to speak for the people who don't get a microphone. For the families who are working 2 jobs and still can't get ahead. For the young people who wonder if truth even matters anymore. And if you think raising your voice can drown them out, you're mistaken. Because I don't need to yell to be heard. I just need to tell the truth. It was the kind of moment that drew goosebumps. The room, once buzzing with Conway's chaos, had gone still again, but this stillness was different. It wasn't shock. It was reverence. People weren't just listening. They were absorbing. Gasps rippled across the studio. A few whispers rose from the crowd, soft exclamations of "Wow!" and "Did you hear that?" The host glanced down at his notes, clearly struggling to regain control of the broadcast, but his expression betrayed the truth. He knew he'd just witnessed something unforgettable. Conway shifted in her chair, her practiced confidence faltering. She forced another smile, but her eyes darted nervously. When she tried to interject, the words stumbled, tripping over themselves. Her once dominant rhythm was gone, replaced by an awkward stammer that only highlighted her unraveling. For the first time in her long television career, she looked cornered. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice or indulge in the spectacle. She simply sat back, her expression serene, her silence once again louder than anything Conway could muster. It was as if she understood that the power had already shifted, that the weight of dignity had already crushed the performance of arrogance. Narrators would later call it the turning point. Analysts would dissect it as a masterclass in political communication. But in real time, the moment was raw, visceral, undeniable. Conway had brought fire, but Crockett had brought water, and in the end it was water that endured. The replay would go viral not because of the scream, though that would dominate the memes, but because of what followed. People didn't just remember Conway's fury, they remembered Crockett's calm. They remembered the precision, the composure, the refusal to be dragged into the mud. And as the cameras captured the split screen, Conway's forced smile against Crockett's unflinching gaze, the story crystallized. This wasn't just another cable news clash. This was a passing of the torch, a moment where one figure's theatrics collapsed under the weight of another's dignity. For Jasmine Crockett, it wasn't about a viral moment. It was about embodying the very thing millions were desperate to see in politics: steadiness in the face of chaos, truth in the face of distortion, dignity in the face of arrogance. And for Kellyanne Conway, it was the unraveling of a persona built on dominance, a mask slipping live on national television. In that moment, the power dynamic flipped, forever captured on live TV. The clash might have unfolded in a studio, but the true battlefield was online. Within minutes of the broadcast, clips began flooding social media timelines. Someone clipped the scream and froze the frame right before Jasmine's reply, turning it into a looping GIF with the caption, "Chaos versus Composure." Others overlaid the moment with dramatic music, turning the pause before Crockett's words into a cinematic beat. Hashtags lit up across platforms. Calm like Crockett, Scream v. Serenity, Truth over Noise. It wasn't just political junkies paying attention. Regular people scrolling through their phones after dinner stumbled on the clip and couldn't look away. They watched the scream, the silence, the calm rebuttal, and they hit replay. Again and again. One comment captured the mood perfectly. "This is how you deal with chaos. Dignity doesn't need to shout." The post racked up hundreds of thousands of likes in hours. News outlets scrambled to catch up. Morning shows replayed the exchange with breathless commentary, framing it as more than a TV spat. "What we saw," one anchor declared, "was a masterclass in composure. Jasmine Crockett showing how to dismantle chaos without sinking into it." The clip was suddenly everywhere. On television, on TikTok, on podcasts, even slipping into late-night comedy monologues. And the memes, oh the memes. Conway's scream was set to opera arias, to heavy metal breakdowns, to screeching car alarms. Crockett's calm reply was paired with captions like, "When the group chat is messy but you've already muted it," and "Introverts dealing with drama" like. But the humor only underscored the truth. People weren't laughing at Crockett, they were laughing with her. The dignity had gone viral. Celebrities weighed in. A-list actors tweeted their admiration. Musicians shared the clip on Instagram stories praising Crockett's poise. One NBA star posted, "That's how you shut down noise." Respect politicians too joined the chorus. Progressive leaders amplified the video, hailing Crockett as a rising voice of reason. Even some centrists, usually cautious in their praise, admitted her handling of the moment was impressive. The contrast couldn't have been starker. For years, Kellyanne Conway had defined the combative, dismissive, relentless style of Trump-era television warfare. She leaned into the spin, thrived on the spectacle, and often left opponents flustered or drowned out. But here, on live TV, that playbook had met its match. Conway had thrown volume, Crockett had answered with composure. Conway had relied on bluster, Crockett had wielded discipline. Average Americans noticed. Posts poured in from teachers, nurses, single parents, people who saw themselves in Crockett's calm refusal to be rattled. One viral TikTok stitched the clip with a mother scolding children while Crockett's line played, "I don't need to yell to be heard, I just need to tell the truth." The message resonated beyond politics. It felt universal. Commentators called it a cultural moment, not just a political one. "We're in an era where people confuse volume with strength," one columnist wrote. "Jasmine Crockett just proved that real strength is composure. That's why this clip won't fade. It touches something deeper than politics." The ripple effect grew larger by the day. Think pieces emerged about the Crockett method. Workshop leaders shared the clip in leadership seminars. High school debate coaches used it as an example of poise under pressure. It wasn't just about who won the argument. It was about redefining the rules of engagement. Meanwhile, Conway found herself on the defensive in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her allies insisted she had been passionate, but the viral edits told a different story. Every replay amplified her as the caricature of chaos, her scream forever frozen in freeze frames and memes. The harder she tried to spin it, the more it slipped from her control. Crockett, by contrast, didn't need to chase the moment. She didn't flood the airwaves or try to own the narrative. She simply let the clip breathe, let it speak for itself. Her restraint became part of the story. It was as though the dignity of the reply extended beyond the broadcast, shaping the aftermath itself. The result was a groundswell. People weren't just entertained, they were inspired. They saw in Crockett a model for navigating a world overloaded with noise and confrontation. Her composure wasn't just admired, it was aspirational. And that was the real revelation. Conway had come into the studio armed with volume, with the old tools of dominance and disruption. But Crockett had walked away with something far more powerful. The ability to turn restraint into a weapon, silence into strategy, dignity into a viral force. The hashtags kept climbing, the memes kept spreading, the commentaries kept multiplying. But beneath the noise, one truth became clear. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a debate. She reframed the rules of engagement. What happened on that stage wasn't just about Kellyanne Conway or Jasmine Crockett. It was about something larger, a lesson millions of people recognized instantly, even if they couldn't yet put it into words. The scream may have dominated the moment, but the calm reply defined the memory. Anger, stripped of substance, collapsed under the weight of its own noise. Calm, grounded in truth, grew stronger with every replay. There's a universal truth here. Outrage exhausts, but dignity endures. People who tuned in didn't just see a clash of personalities. They saw a clash of styles, of values, of ways of being. Conway's fury looked familiar. The bullying boss, the domineering relative, the politician who drowns out accountability. Crockett's composure felt revolutionary, a refusal to bend, but also a refusal to break. She wasn't performing calm, she was inhabiting it, and that made all the difference. In that moment, Crockett became more than a congresswoman from Texas. She became a symbol of what the next generation of political leadership could look like. Sharp, but not cruel. Firm, but not frantic. Passionate, but disciplined. Her calm didn't read as weakness, it read as control, the kind of control that turns chaos into opportunity. For years, American politics has rewarded those who yell the loudest, who dominate airtime by sheer volume. But this exchange showed something different. That silence can disarm. That composure can cut deeper than confrontation. People watching weren't just applauding Crockett's words. They were recognizing a new model of strength, one that doesn't need to mimic arrogance to defeat it. And in that recognition, the clash transcended its studio setting. Viewers carried the lesson into their own lives. Teachers used the clip in classrooms to show how calm can shift power. Parents shared it with their kids as a reminder that dignity matters more than shouting back. Workers replayed it as motivation before walking into tough meetings. The moment was political, yes, but it was also personal. That's why it stuck. Because it wasn't just about politics, it was about a principle. When arrogance rises, calm resistance can hold the line. When noise erupts, truth doesn't need to match its volume to be heard. And when chaos tries to claim the stage, composure can quietly rewrite the script. The clash revealed something profound about power itself. Power isn't always in the scream, the glare, the cutting dismissal. Sometimes power is in the pause, the breath, the refusal to be pulled into the spiral of fury. Sometimes the loudest scream in the room isn't the one that wins, it's the silence that follows the truth. And with that, Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an exchange on live TV. She left us with a reminder that could ripple far beyond politics. Dignity is not passive, it is active, it is resilient. And in the face of arrogance and noise, it can be the most transformative force of all. It all started with a scream, a live television clash that no one could ignore. Kellyanne Conway, red-faced and raging, tried to seize control with volume, with force, with the familiar arrogance of a Trump-era strategist. But what the world remembers is not the fury. What the world remembers is Jasmine Crockett's calm, her poise, her refusal to be pulled into the chaos. That single moment, her measured, devastating reply, became the heartbeat of the story. The reason this clip spread across the internet like wildfire. The video title tells the tale. Kellyanne Conway screams. Jasmine Crockett replies with calm. But behind that headline lives the deeper truth. Conway's bluster wasn't dismantled by louder words. It was dismantled by dignity. The viral clash wasn't just a battle of personalities. It was a reminder that in our politics, in our communities, even in our personal lives, composure can turn arrogance into emptiness. Millions shared this moment not just because it was dramatic, but because it felt necessary. At a time when outrage has become the default currency of our public life, Crockett's steadiness reminded us that there's another way, that leadership doesn't have to scream to be strong, that the future doesn't belong to those who shout the loudest, but to those who speak with clarity, courage, and control. So here's the invitation. If you believe dignity is stronger than chaos, share this story. If you believe calm leadership deserves more space in our politics, hit subscribe and help amplify voices like Jasmine Crockett's. Because this movement, this hunger for accountability, for composure, for truth spoken without fear, is bigger than one clash. It's about building a culture where calm resistance doesn't just survive, it wins. And that's why this moment matters. Because what Jasmine Crockett showed us on that stage wasn't just a reply to Kellyanne Conway, it was a lesson to all of us. That strength isn't in the scream, it's in the silence that follows the truth. Because sometimes, the calmest voice is the one that echoes the loudest.